50 Essays by George Orwell. Spilling the Spanish Beans, 1937. The Spanish War has probably produced a richer crop of lies than any event since the Great War of 1914–18, but I honestly doubt, in spite of all those hecatombs of nuns who have been raped and crucified before the eyes of Daily Mail reporters, whether it is the pro-fascist newspapers that have done the most harm. It is the left-wing papers, the News Chronicle and the Daily Worker, with their far subtler methods of distortion, that have prevented the British public from grasping the real nature of the struggle. The fact which these papers have so carefully obscured is that the Spanish government, including the semi-autonomous Catalan government, is far more afraid of the revolution than of the fascists. It is now almost certain that the war will end with some kind of compromise, and there is even reason to doubt whether the government, which let Bilbao fail without raising a finger, wishes to be too victorious, but there is no doubt whatever about the thoroughness with which it is crushing its own revolutionaries. For some time past, a reign of terror, forcible suppression of political parties, a stifling censorship of the press, ceaseless espionage, and mass imprisonment without trial has been in progress. When I left Barcelona in late June, the jails were bulging. Indeed, the regular jails had long since overflowed and the prisoners were being huddled into empty shops and any other temporary dump that could be found for them. But the point to notice is that the people who are in prison now are not fascists but revolutionaries. They are there not because their opinions are too much to the right, but because they are too much to the left. And the people responsible for putting them there are those dreadful revolutionaries at whose very name Garvin quakes in his galoshes, the communists. Meanwhile, the war against Franco continues, but, except for the poor devils in the front-line trenches, nobody in government Spain thinks of it as the real war. The real struggle is between revolution and counter-revolution, between the workers who are vainly trying to hold on to a little of what they won in 1936, and the liberal communist bloc who are so successfully taking it away from them. It is unfortunate that so few people in England have yet caught up with the fact that communism is now a counter-revolutionary force, that communists everywhere are in alliance with bourgeois reformism and using the whole of their powerful machinery to crush or discredit any party that shows signs of revolutionary tendencies. Hence the grotesque spectacle of communists assailed as wicked Reds by right-wing intellectuals who are in essential agreement with them. Mr. Wyndham Lewis, for instance, ought to love the communists, at least temporarily. In Spain, the Communist-Liberal alliance has been almost completely victorious. Of all that the Spanish workers won for themselves in 1936, nothing solid remains, except for a few collective farms and a certain amount of land seized by the peasants last year, and presumably even the peasants will be sacrificed later, when there is no longer any need to placate them. To see how the present situation arose, one has got to look back to the origins of the Civil War. Franco's bid for power differed from those of Hitler and Mussolini in that it was a military insurrection, comparable to a foreign invasion, and therefore had not much mass backing, though Franco has since been trying to acquire one. Its chief supporters, apart from certain sections of big business, were the landowning aristocracy and the huge, parasitic church. Obviously, a rising of this kind will array against it various forces which are not in agreement on any other point. The peasant and the worker hate feudalism and clericalism, but so does the liberal bourgeois, who is not in the least opposed to a more modern version of fascism, at least so long as it isn't called fascism. The liberal bourgeois is genuinely liberal up to the point where his own interests stop. He stands for the degree of progress implied in the phrase la correa alvert auxiliary talents. For clearly he has no chance to develop in a feudal society where the worker and the peasant are too poor to buy goods, where industry is burdened with huge taxes to pay for bishops' vestments, and where every lucrative job is given as a matter of course to the friend of the catamite of the duke's illegitimate son. Hence, in the face of such a blatant reactionary as Franco, you get for a while a situation in which the worker and the bourgeois, in reality deadly enemies, are fighting side by side. This uneasy alliance is known as the Popular Front, or, in the communist press, to give it a spuriously democratic appeal, People's Front. It is a combination with about as much vitality, and about as much right to exist, as a pig with two heads or some other Barnum and Bailey monstrosity. In any serious emergency, the contradiction implied in the popular front is bound to make itself felt. For even when the worker and the bourgeois are both fighting against fascism, they are not fighting for the same things. The bourgeois is fighting for bourgeois democracy, i.e. capitalism, the worker, insofar as he understands the issue, for socialism. And in the early days of the revolution, the Spanish workers understood the issue very well. In the areas where fascism was defeated, they did not content themselves with driving the rebellious troops out of the towns. They also took the opportunity of seizing land and factories and setting up the rough beginnings of a workers' government by means of local committees, workers' militias, police forces, and so forth. They made the mistake, however, possibly because most of the active revolutionaries were anarchists with a mistrust of all parliaments, of leaving the republican government in nominal control. And, in spite of various changes in personnel, every subsequent government had been of approximately the same bourgeois reformist character. At the beginning this seemed not to matter, because the government, especially in Catalonia, was almost powerless and the bourgeoisie had to lie low or even, this was still happening when I reached Spain in December, to disguise themselves as workers. Later, as power slipped from the hands of the anarchists into the hands of the communists and right-wing socialists, the government was able to reassert itself, the bourgeoisie came out of hiding and the old division of society into rich and poor reappeared, not much modified. Henceforward every move, except a few dictated by military emergency, was directed towards undoing the work of the first few months of revolution. Out of the many illustrations I could choose, I will cite only one. The breaking up of the old workers' militias, which were organized on a genuinely democratic system, with officers and men receiving the same pay and mingling on terms of complete equality, and the substitution of the popular army, once again, in communist jargon, people's army, modeled as far as possible on an ordinary bourgeois army, with a privileged officer caste, immense differences of pay, etc. etc. Needless to say, this is given out as a military necessity, and almost certainly it does make for military efficiency, at least for a short period. But the undoubted purpose of the change was to strike a blow at equalitarianism. In every department the same policy has been followed, with the result that only a year after the outbreak of war and revolution you get what is in effect an ordinary bourgeois state, with, in addition, a reign of terror to preserve the status quo. This process would probably have gone less far if the struggle could have taken place without foreign interference. But the military weakness of the government made this impossible. In the face of France's foreign mercenaries they were obliged to turn to Russia for help, and though the quantity of arms supplied by Russia has been greatly exaggerated, in my first 3 months in Spain I saw only one Russian weapon, a solitary machine gun. The mere fact of their arrival brought the communists into power. To begin with, the Russian aeroplanes and guns, and the good military qualities of the international brigades, not necessarily communist but under communist control, immensely raised the communist prestige. But, more important, since Russia and Mexico were the only countries openly supplying arms, the Russians were able not only to get money for their weapons, but to extort terms as well. Put in their crudest form, the terms were, crush the revolution or you get no more arms. The reason usually given for the Russian attitude is that if Russia appeared to be abetting the revolution, the Franco-Soviet Pact, and the hoped-for alliance with Great Britain, would be imperiled. It may be, also, that the spectacle of a genuine revolution in Spain would rouse unwanted echoes in Russia. The communists, of course, deny that any direct pressure has been exerted by the Russian government. But this, even if true, is hardly relevant, for the communist parties of all countries can be taken as carrying out Russian policy, and it is certain that the Spanish Communist Party, plus the right-wing socialists whom they control, plus the communist press of the whole world, have used all their immense and ever-increasing influence upon the side of counter-revolution. In the first half of this article I suggested that the real struggle in Spain, on the government side, has been between revolution and counter-revolution, that the government, though anxious enough to avoid being beaten by Franco, has been even more anxious to undo the revolutionary changes with which the outbreak of war was accompanied. Any communist would reject this suggestion as mistaken or willfully dishonest. He would tell you that it is nonsense to talk of the Spanish government crushing the revolution, because the revolution never happened, and that our job at present is to defeat fascism and defend democracy. And in this connection it is most important to see just how the communist anti-revolutionary propaganda works. It is a mistake to think that this has no relevance in England, where the Communist Party is small and comparatively weak. We shall see its relevance quickly enough if England enters into an alliance with the USSR, or perhaps even earlier, for the influence of the Communist Party is bound to increase, visibly is increasing, as more and more of the capitalist class realize that latter-day communism is playing their game. Broadly speaking, communist propaganda depends upon terrifying people with the, quite real, horrors of fascism. It also involves pretending, not in so many words, but by implication, that fascism has nothing to do with capitalism. Fascism is just a kind of meaningless wickedness, an aberration, mass sadism, the sort of thing that would happen if you suddenly let loose an asylum full of homicidal maniacs. Present fascism in this form, and you can mobilize public opinion against it, at any rate for a while, without provoking any revolutionary movement. You can oppose fascism by bourgeois democracy, meaning capitalism. But meanwhile you have got to get rid of the troublesome person who points out that fascism and bourgeois democracy are tweedledum and tweedly. You do it at the beginning by calling him an impracticable visionary. You tell him that he is confusing the issue, that he is splitting the anti-fascist forces, that this is not the moment for revolutionary phrasemongering, that for the moment we have got to fight against fascism without inquiring too closely what we are fighting for. Later, if he still refuses to shut up, you change your tune and call him a traitor. More exactly, you call him a Trotskyist. And what is a Trotskyist? This terrible word. In Spain at this moment you can be thrown into jail and kept there indefinitely, without trial, on the mere rumor that you are a Trotskyist is only beginning to be bandied to and fro in England. We shall be hearing more of it later. The word Trotskyist, or Trotskyfascist, is generally used to mean a disguised fascist who poses as an ultra-revolutionary in order to split the left-wing forces. But it derives its peculiar power from the fact that it means three separate things. It can mean one who, like Trotsky, wished for world revolution, or a member of the actual organization of which Trotsky is head, the only legitimate use of the word, or the disguised fascist already mentioned. The three meanings can be telescoped one into the other at will. Meaning number one may or may not carry with it meaning number two, and meaning number two almost invariably carries with it meaning number three. Thus, XY has been heard to speak favorably of world revolution, therefore he is a Trotskyist, therefore he is a fascist. In Spain, to some extent even in England, anyone professing revolutionary socialism, i.e. professing the things the Communist Party professed until a few years ago, is under suspicion of being a Trotskyist in the pay of Franco or Hitler. The accusation is a very subtle one, because in any given case, unless one happened to know the contrary, it might be true. A fascist spy probably would disguise himself as a revolutionary. In Spain, everyone whose opinions are to the left of those of the Communist Party is sooner or later discovered to be a Trotskyist or, at least, a traitor. At the beginning of the war the POUM, an opposition communist party roughly corresponding to the English ILP, was an accepted party and supplied a minister to the Catalan government. Later it was expelled from the government, then it was denounced as Trotskyist, then it was suppressed, every member that the police could lay their hands on being flung into jail. Until a few months ago the anarcho-syndicalists were described as working loyally beside the communists. Then the anarcho-syndicalists were levered out of the government, then it appeared that they were not working so loyally, now they are in the process of becoming traitors. After that will come the turn of the left-wing socialists. Caballero, the left-wing socialist ex-premier, until May 1937 the idol of the communist press, is already in outer darkness, a Trotskyist and enemy of the people. And so the game continues. The logical end is a regime in which every opposition party and newspaper is suppressed and every dissentient of any importance is in jail. Of course, such a regime will be fascism. It will not be the same as the fascism Franco would impose, It will even be better than Franco's fascism to the extent of being worth fighting for, but it will be fascism. Only, being operated by communists and liberals, it will be called something different. Meanwhile, can the war be won? The communist influence has been against revolutionary chaos and has therefore, apart from the Russian aid, tended to produce greater military efficiency. If the anarchists saved the government from August to October 1936, the communists have saved it from October onwards. But in organizing the defense they have succeeded in killing enthusiasm, inside Spain, not outside. They made a militarized conscript army possible, but they also made it necessary. It is significant that as early as January of this year voluntary recruiting had practically ceased. A revolutionary army can sometimes win by enthusiasm, but a conscript army has got to win with weapons, and it is unlikely that the government will ever have a large preponderance of arms unless France intervenes or unless Germany and Italy decide to make off with the Spanish colonies and leave Franco in the lurch. On the whole, a deadlock seems the likeliest thing. And does the government seriously intend to win? It does not intend to lose, that is certain. On the other hand, an outright victory, with Franco in flight and the Germans and Italians driven into the sea, would raise difficult problems, some of them too obvious to need mentioning. There is no real evidence and one can only judge by the event, but I suspect that what the government is playing for is a compromise that would leave the war situation essentially in being. All prophecies are wrong, therefore this one will be wrong, but I will take a chance and say that though the war may end quite soon or may drag on for years, it will end with Spain divided up, either by actual frontiers or into economic zones. Of course, such a compromise might be claimed as a victory by either side, or by both. All that I have said in this article would seem entirely commonplace in Spain, or even in France. Yet in England, in spite of the intense interest the Spanish War has aroused, there are very few people who have even heard of the enormous struggle that is going on behind the government lines. Of course, this is no accident. There has been a quite deliberate conspiracy, I could give detailed instances, to prevent the Spanish situation from being understood. People who ought to know better have lent themselves to the deception on the ground that if you tell the truth about Spain it will be used as fascist propaganda. It is easy to see where such cowardice leads. If the British public had been given a truthful account of the Spanish War they would have had an opportunity of learning what fascism is and how it can be combated. As it is, the News Chronicle version of fascism as a kind of homicidal mania peculiar to Colonel Blimp's bombinating in the economic void has been established more firmly than ever. And thus we are one step nearer to the Great War against fascism, compared to 1914, against militarism, which will allow fascism, British variety, to be slipped over our necks during the first week.